Welcome everyone to September's Human Traces webinar. I'm John Boyle. I'm a member of the Human Traces working group. It's usually Natalie running these seminars, but I'm standing in for this occasion. So this month, I'm delighted that Jeff Blackford accepted our invitation to present his research on the impact of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers on the paleoecological record of various sites in Northwest Europe. So Jeff has travelled fairly widely in his work with very productive spells at Hull and Manchester and before. He spent some years with us at Liverpool and is now at Dundee as a dean of his school. So Jeff's research interests have been, they've been centred on paleoecological methods, particularly analysis of peat sequences, and with a particular emphasis on pollen-related biotic remains, but also on tephra. But he's applied this very widely, including evaluating past climate, reconstructing histories of volcanic eruptions using tephra, and exploring peat records of landscape change that are associated with archaeological evidence of human occupation. And of course, that's what ties in so closely with the agenda of the Human Traces working group. So we're very pleased then to welcome him to give this talk on distinguishing human traces from natural events in Mesolithic peat proxy records. So over to you, Jeff, and I'll turn my sound off.
Great, thanks. Is the screen share working?
Yep.
Yep, great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. My research that I'm going to talk about today, I shouldn't even call it my research. It's very much a team effort. And in fact, even what we're building on goes back to work done particularly by people like Kevin Edwards and Ian Simmons, and it's a refining and kind of trying to answer some of the same questions. And I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. My own career has gone very much into, some people call it a greasy pole of climbing the management ladder. But I assure you, for those of you who have done the same, it's definitely a slippery slope. And you get to the point where doing a management type job occupies your entire head, even if it doesn't occupy every hour. And so it's been great for me to have this opportunity to think through where we are with some of these projects, and also the more up-to-date stuff, which I'll come to at the end. Some of you will already know, in which case I apologise. Hopefully by the end, some of the data and some of the ideas will be at least newish. So the aim is to review the types of evidence for the first impacts of human activity in the paleoecological records of the Holocene. And the time period I'm going to talk about is the Mesolithic, as the Northwest European version of the Mesolithic. So somewhere between 9,500 to 10,000 years BP and 5,500 years BP. The middle stages of the Stone Age evolved to a woodland environment from the Paleolithic, but distinct from the ceramic using, fabric using, settled agriculturalists of the Neolithic. And the types of proxies I'm going to talk about are pollen, charcoal, NPPs, but within non-pollen polymorphs, very specifically fungal spores, some analysis of in situ wood, and if I don't run out of time, I'll also talk about some geochemistry briefly as well, and then I'll try and summarise. Main contributors to this work are Jim Innes, who some of you probably know, who also was briefly, or was quite a while working at Liverpool, and then moved to Durham and is now retired, but actually not really retired. Sarah Neen, who was a PhD student at Manchester and now does something totally different. Tim Mile, who's at Aberdeen. Peter Ryan, who's at Manchester, and Henry, who works at the University of London. Bruce Albert, who last seen in Prague, but could be anywhere. And Peter Rowley-Conway, who's also semi-retired archaeologist at Durham. We've had quite a lot of funding, they're listed there. And as I mentioned, it actually builds on a much longer legacy of original thinkers and science pioneers in these fields. So the aim is really in keeping with the aims of your human traces group, is to look for really what are the first traces. What I've tried to do is pick out which of them, if any, are definitive. So the background, again, some of you will know, so I'll go quite quickly. In the UK, in Ireland, and in some other parts of Northwest Europe, there's evidence for forest disturbance associated with hunter-gatherer activity. This is often seen as being the first traces of human impact in the post-glacial period. And there are some lowland sites that show similar patterns, but the majority of it is the evidence comes from what in the UK we call uplands, which in the UK is not big parts of the UK quite flat, so it's not what most people call a mountain. And the typical altitude range is somewhere between about 300 and 500 meters above sea level. And most of the evidence, or again, not quite all, comes from peat deposits. And that's partly because they're there, and partly because at the base of these upland peats, there's a lot of erosion, and in the erosion, the flints and sometimes other archaeological artifacts from the Mesolithic period are found in sometimes great abundance, literally thousands of flints. And this has led to the subsequent paleontological investigations of the same material. The Mesolithic impacts hypothesis, which has been around since the 1980s, is that woodland disturbance was deliberately undertaken to improve the food productivity of an area. And this would by people would manipulate the vegetation in woodlands to produce more of a mix of woodlands and open areas. And this would increase the grazing and the browsing opportunities for their animals that they depended on, particularly deer, wild boar, and aurochs, or Bos primigenius, the now extinct precursor to domestic cattle in Europe. Sometimes fire was used, but also it's suggested that sometimes ring barking was used as a way of creating and then maintaining clearances. And it's also been suggested that once made, these clearances were naturally kept open by animal activity and potentially by fires, because the vegetation that grew in the clearings was more likely to burn than the woodland it preceded. And a typical example of that comes from North Gill on the North Yorkshire Moors, work published in great detail in a number of different papers by Jim Innes and by Ian Simmons, where you get disturbance in the tree species, sometimes quite subtle, sometimes only affecting 2 or 3 of the species, an increase in fluctuations in open ground indicators. And I know looking at pollen diagrams in presentations is difficult, so if you just look at the broad headings and trust me, and if you don't trust me, I can send you the papers later. And then also periods of charcoal. And at North Gill was a little bit original and distinctive at the time in that a lot of these charcoal are visible horizons. It's not relying on micro charcoal from pollen slides, but you can actually see layers of burnt material. And this enabled Jim Innes in particular and his co-workers to pick out phases of regeneration and disturbance. And on these diagrams, I'm using a yellow box for disturbance and a green for regeneration, and the bits in between, which are labeled T on this part of the diagram, are kind of transitional phases. And so this model, if you like, Mesolithic impacts model, was then corroborated at different sites across this area of the North Yorkshire Moors, most recently published in Vegetation History and Archaeobotany, I think, or Holocene, I can't remember, by Albert and Innes at a site called Esclets, where you have a similar pattern of fire associated with woodland disturbance, but just for a short phase of time. Now, we could call this the North Gill model, because that's where it's best exemplified. And the hypothesis there is developed slightly in that the scale and the return interval of these fires can be reconstructed because of the macrofossil remains and the macro charcoal remains. And through a huge survey, mostly based on boreholes, but also exposures of peat profiles in the banks of a stream, they put together a kind of hypothetical situation where fires of 20 to 100 meter diameter scale were recurring on time intervals of 10 to 50 years, sometimes a bit bigger, sometimes a bit smaller, sometimes more quicker succession, sometimes with longer gaps. So some areas would be burned 2 or 3 times in that time period, some areas only burned once, and some areas not burned at all. And the theory is that the chances of those fires occurring naturally are quite small for a number of reasons, one of which is the vegetation at the time was distinctly non-combustible, deciduous, fairly damp woodland on a damp peaty substrate. And also the size of the fires. If a fire takes hold in a woodland, it either does or it doesn't. So based on modern observations, this was the theory that's led to people to put together this Mesolithic disturbance model to explain the charcoal records and the woodland disturbance. We then tested this with 2 or 3 different papers where we looked at higher resolution, or in some cases look at the same samples to test for whether there was any burning shown by Gelasinospora and Neurospora, or grazing shown by Spora Podospora, potentially grazing shown by increases in Sordaceae2, but some of these other species will occur across a wider range of decomposing wood, for example, but would increase in the presence of dung, but they don't necessarily need it. So the fungal spores we use as a kind of semi-independent test from the pollen and charcoal data to see, do these increase in or decrease in ways which test that basic model. So if you look back at North Gill site again, and this is summary, these are some of the fungal spores and those same phases of disturbance, transition, regeneration, etc. And what we showed was that fire indicators were present in the beginning in this first open indicators with some coprophilous fungi. This is Spora, the obligate dung fungus, or 99% obligate dung fungus. Then you have a period where there was fewer dung fungi as the trees regenerated slightly, and then another bigger disturbance phase, this time with a lot more dung fungi, and then a gradual diminution of coprophilous fungi as the area regenerated. So that would lend some evidence to show, still not definitively that people did it, but that these disturbances were favoured by increases in the occurrence of dung-producing animals. So at this stage in the process, what the main ideas are that the NPPs show an increase in dung fungi following burning phases. And this is North Gill, but there are other sites that show the same. Blackheath on the Pennines, Bonfield Gill, Blueworth Beck, other sites on the North Yorkshire Moors, and others. But it's not a universal rule. We also found sites, particularly at Dartmoor, where there were high levels of dung fungi in undisturbed phases, and actually less in the disturbed phases. And this makes you think, well, actually, that's quite logical. We know that hunter-gatherers were effective at hunting and they caused extinctions. So they could easily cause a local extinction or such a diminution of animal populations that, in fact, you don't get more dung fungi when the people are around and the clearings are made. You could get none. And at that North Gill site, that reduction of dung fungi down to almost none would fit with that kind of overhunting model, if you like. So linked to that is this idea that hunter-gatherers were sustainable. And we know that hunter-gatherers can be sustainable, but we also know sometimes that they just get lucky and they're sustainable. And other times the systems lead to over-exploitation. Now, later in the Mesolithic, there's evidence of cereal type pollen and pollen grains that have the physical characteristics of cultivated cereals in contexts and dated profiles which are of age-defined Mesolithic aged. So they're not necessarily with a Mesolithic archaeological context, but they're known to be what we would see as being too early for cereal cultivation, in that being one of the main indicators of the arrival of the Neolithic. And these are identified by grain size, by pore protrusion, annular diameter, and in some cases by surface ornamentation of the grain. Some of the earlier studies just based it on the size of the grain, but we know partly through the work of Joly and of Edwards and co-workers and Bearer that we need to be a bit more sophisticated. One of the sites where this has been most clearly shown, or a new pattern has been most clearly shown, is Bala on the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man is a medium-sized island of about 30 kilometres length. It's part way between northwest England and the island of Ireland. And we showed there a number of phases, a fire phase. This is high resolution, so this whole sequence is 80 millimetres, and the samples are 4 millimetre intervals. Showed a phase of fire, followed by fire and indicators of dung, indicators of animals, then a distinctive phase with cereal type pollen and no sporomiella whatsoever, and reduced other dung type fungi. Then another phase of fire and dung, and then another phase of cereal type, and then a regeneration phase where nothing much happened on these indicators, and the woodland regenerated a little bit during that phase. And then we hit what is a more regular Neolithic phase with a big increase in open ground indicators, large increase in dung indicating fungi, but that's not really as contentious as the stuff that came earlier. So we dated that to be around 5,925 plus or minus 60 BP, and various referees, etc., didn't believe it. So we dated it again 5870, so overlapping within the same age range. And the earliest Neolithic artifact for that region is around 700 radiocarbon years later. And even that, and that's a contested date. There's another 2 videos before there's consistent dating of a Neolithic arrival on the island. So there's a number of aspects to this which are interesting, one of which is you've got pastoral and cereal growing phases of land use, if you take the interpretation at face value, and they appear to be mutually exclusive, which will suggest that the Mesolithic people had a way of excluding animals, field boundaries, or just overhunting them. We obviously don't know. This fitted with what seemed at the time to be a pattern of similarly dated cereal type pollen in radiocarbon dated pollen records from British Isles and from Northern Europe. But relevant to this group in this talk, we also know that the identification of cereal pollen is not 100% equivocal. And although we would love that to be the obvious tracer for human arrival and human impact, there are species with potentially overlapping pollen grain size and annular diameter. In particular, these are some wetland and coastal species, and we know the Bala site was in a river valley, and at the time probably 5 to 6 kilometres from the coast. The next idea was to try and reverse this process of thinking, if you like, and say, well, all of these sites, including Bala which has got a very rich Mesolithic archaeology, as have a lot of these upland peat sites, we thought, well, why don't we go to a site where there's no known archaeology and see what happened there? And the site had previously been worked on by Mile et al., Mount Gabriel in Southwest Ireland. And this is the most contentious one. This is where I've been to a conference and people have genuinely laughed. And I've been told basically to go away, you English know-all, you don't know what you're talking about, and go back to school. At the time it was annoying, but now I think actually it was quite funny. Oh no, I wish I'd had a good reply heckle at the time. So this site is Southwest Ireland, where there's no archaeological evidence for Mesolithic this is, this is an interpolated radiocarbon age. There was a distinct phase of fall in tree pollen types associated with micro-charcoal, weed species, and open ground indicators, but no cereal pollen. So we look back at this in a lot more detail, high resolution scanning for rare types, not just cereal pollen, any rare types, and redated to so that the sample with a high charcoal record was actually dated rather than just interpolated between dates above and below. And we found again a pattern of burning and then potentially cereal pollen types, and then less burning but consistent for a period of unknown length of time because the dates are not really distinguishable once you've calibrated them. But based on the overall accumulation rate between the top and the bottom, probably a period of 60 to 80 years, and then something similar again. Some weed species, but not in great abundance. No spore and yellow at all, so we can't make a nice story of animals then grazing, animals then grazing. But in other ways, similar to what we'd found elsewhere, but with some distinct differences. And the age range, again, in this same type of period as some of those other early cereals. So at this stage, you've got another set of issues, if you like, and problems. There seems to be evidence of small-scale growing of cultivated cereals, but this is totally out of keeping with everything else we know about the late Mesolithic people. They didn't have the things that usually go with cereal cultivation, such as ceramics or any way of storing cereals, for example, or any way of, as far as we know, there's no wider package of domestication. What there are a few anthelomatics from approximately the same age, and a change to a different type of microlith, which in some areas is called rod-type microliths. It was potentially a different group of people or a cultural change at that time, with a similar range of dates. Blackheath, because I'm giving a slightly shorter version, I'm going to skip, but it's another site that shows the same, but with a really amazingly detailed and high counts way of studying it, and that's published by Peter Ryan. Another site we've worked on is called West Fieldstone Moor, and this is another type of proxy, if you like, another range of indicators. And at this site, we had access to the actual wood itself. So most of the woodland disturbance sites we've worked on, you're working on a proxy, which is pollen. At this site, we had access to areas where, because of a peat slide and a big landslide, it was possible to then re-excavate a little bit further and get down to the wood itself. So we did this like a big archaeological site, excavated it, recorded it, photographed it at each level. And I have to say, even though it's very exciting to do, and the results were a bit disappointing, but in hindsight, they're a little bit predictable. The first thing is that we mostly found roots. And of course, you would like to find roots. It seems obvious afterwards because the roots penetrate into the waterlogged soil and peat, and therefore they are really well preserved. Everything else is less well preserved. So roots, leaves, twigs, some seeds, all really well preserved. Beetles well preserved. But what we were looking for were things like trunks and branches to see if they'd been cut or burned or ring-barked or had evidence of being impacted by deer, for example. But we really didn't find the evidence for that. We found a lack of evidence, not because we found the branches, but we didn't even really find the branches and trunks. They just weren't preserved. So either this woodland was exploited and those bits of wood were removed by people, or possibly more likely, they're just not preserved because they decay above ground before the peat grows up. We did find 3D evidence of these micro charcoal layers to corroborate the fact that they were in situ burning and not just ash that had been transported longer distances. And we did find those associated with the same type of pollen and charcoal phases that we'd shown in other sites from the North Yorkshire Moors. Just to show the methods, and again, Pete Ryan, Sarah Neen, and a few others spent a lot of time working on all these wood samples, cleaning them exceptionally carefully so as not to disturb any potential marks on the wood. But we didn't find anything really that you couldn't get from either branches rubbing against each other, from damage that could occur once the branch was on the ground. And we did a bit of analogue matching, looking at wet woodlands now and the types of material you get preserved. Microscopic analysis of some of the wood remains to identify the species. One thing we did find, this was a pine, small pine tree that was growing at the time, and it did survive at least one fire. So there's a fire scar that goes around about 2/3 of this stump when the tree was somewhere in its early 20s years old. And if the fire had been major fire, based on recent fires, we would expect young trees not to survive, and we would expect older trees to survive a big fire. So it maybe suggests, which a number of people suggested, that the fires that we had in the Mesolithic weren't big forest fires. It was the understory, it was burning quickly. Perhaps the fire front moved quickly through the more flammable aspects of the litter layer and left the bigger trees intact. So to summarise what we found from there, we've got stumps with occasional fire scars. We've got pollen and charcoal showing longer phases of disturbance than elsewhere, but also open ground indicators, including open ground beetles, present throughout. And they could have been, so it could indicate that this was just a small area of localised wet woodland, rather than the whole of that upland landscape being forested. One last one, so we've got some time for a few questions, quick questions, is this is another site in the Pennines, Danclough Moss. And this is work done by Sarah Neen in her PhD, which is a brilliant piece of work that those of us who supervised it and her have been a bit remiss in publishing. It's published in bits, but there's some really good stuff that we need to get out in the next few months. March Hill is this hill, which is a very distinctive hill where you come across it from most directions. And it's a feature of Mesolithic archaeology is that they did like prominent geographical features. You often get flint scatters on or just on the shoulders of this type of hill, whether it gave them visibility to see or be seen, we're not quite sure. And there are a number of archaeological sites on the summit, hearths, and in the valleys nearby and on the saddle area, deep peat up to 2.5 meters that goes back around 7,000 years. What we've tried for the purposes of this talk, I'm not going to go into all the great detail of the charcoal and the pollen, etc., because it's not that different from the other sites I've talked about. What is different is that Sarah tried the geochemical approach using XRF to see, well, if these people were disturbing the ground at all, that would show up in any titanium and silicone as indicators of the of eroded material getting into the peat at the base of that slope from that distinctive hill feature. There are 3 points where you get higher levels, and the first one is at the end of the disturbance phase, and at this point, obviously doing PhD, you get very excited. And then the second one, there's a disturbance phase, but actually no peak. And then the third one is also in a disturbance phase, and this last one is a little bit as well. So it's not clear, but the 3 major peaks are in potential disturbance phases. So we've got a number of indicators we can use. Each one is still not definitive, but when you get a range of them present in the same location, the chances of all of those indicators of human impact and the Mesolithic impact model being caused by something else other than the Mesolithic people who we know were there in most cases, it becomes less probable. But even though I would love to say it's all people were definitely there, there's still the possibility, particularly in places like in Southwest Ireland, that actually there was no one there at all. And you had naturally occurring clearings in the woodland. Those then become self-perpetuating. The vegetation that grows there is more likely to burn naturally. And they have envelopes, time periods where the climatic envelope is more susceptible to fire. And the fire is the key to it in most cases, because the fire would allow species change in the woodland and the woodland edge, and would enable animals to occupy it, and then potentially for people then to occupy, to use that space, but not necessarily have created it. Why does it matter? It matters a bit. It matters because it's interesting, but it matters a little bit also now because there's a big change in the UK, at least, towards trying to rewild and restore some of these upland areas. And this research, I think, feeds into that. What actually is a natural environment for some of these upland areas? Were they all naturally wooded? Were they open? Were they a mixture? Naturally, they probably burned. Naturally, they may, in many areas, they probably naturally became less densely forested and peat started to fall. So we can feed into that debate. And my final slide then is this location, another location on the North Yorkshire Moors called Esclitz, where we've got 3 blocks of peat extracted from an area fortuitously found right by a footpath, where there are late Mesolithic age flints actually embedded in the peat. So there's some evidence that there was actually somebody there at that time. Unfortunately, what we found so far, high resolution pollen through this profile here, where you can see the samples have been dug out, is not much happened. So the people were there, but this isn't a particular disturbance phase at all. But at least we know there's somebody there. And what I would like, what I would have hypothesized for there would be a big charcoal peak around disturbance phase, etc. But there isn't one. So I'm going to stop sharing there with that inconclusive conclusion and invite any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. That was absolutely fascinating. I have lots of questions, but I won't hog the scene. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Perhaps there's not that many of us, so just speak up if you have a question. Or put something in the chat if you'd rather.
Thank you, Jeff. That was really nice. I just have one question with the Isle of Man.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know the geography and like the population. I was wondering when did they arrive there? Did they walk and then were they sailing?
Were they
like how sailing? How did people arrive there? Like for the Neolithic?
Oh yeah, the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, well, in the earliest Mesolithic, they could have walked because the sea level was lower. In the later Mesolithic, they would have had to go by boat. And we know that in Denmark, for example, they found quite a few boats, well preserved, mostly dugout type boats, so large trunks dug into canoes, but also some frame and hide boats. And you can see the Isle of Man from all around. So you can see it from North Wales, you can see it from Northwest England, and you can see it from Ireland. So it's not impossible that people could have seen it and set out to get there.
I have some questions and comments. One of the things I'm really struck by is that you're facing exactly the same problem that we have, that you've got the question about whether you're seeking definitive answers and proof, if you like, or whether you're looking for balance of evidence. And that's one we are still trying to get to grips with. I wondered if you had any sort of guidance on that.
It's a good philosophical question, and it's one that we usually end up with, that balance of probability. And you try to be quantitative and objective, but sometimes one's conclusion ends up being probably. And this is why I quite like these sites that we've found a couple of now, where the flints are embedded in the peat, because at least you know there was somebody there.
Yeah.
Okay, not somebody approximately in the area at around the same time.
That's really interesting. That sounds like.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also the, for example, of your flint. You found a flint.
Yeah.
But I suppose that person could have been wandering through there and dropped it.
Well, if it was just one, yes. This one has got a scatter, so we know someone, at the very least, sat there and chipped away,
Right, all right, okay.
trying to make something useful. We haven't found any of the useful things. We've found some cores and lots of debitage, the microliths left by manufacture. But yes, but they could have just paused there slightly on their way somewhere else. And also there is some suggestion that dense solid objects might be mobile in the peat profile. Now, I don't think they are now, but they might have been in the first few years. So the peat surface at the time was dominated by sedge. So we know from the pollen and there's some sphagnum, so it's probably a wet bog. And that flint may have settled. They might have gone down into the surface a bit. Similarly, we know there's people there, we know there's animals there, it could have got trampled and turned in a bit. So it might not be the exact level at which the human occupation. But we also know that supposing it was squished down by about 50 millimeters at the time or so, we know that 50 millimeters becomes 5 millimeters with 6,000 years of decomposition. So although it might not be in the exact horizon, it's probably within 5 to 10 millimeters of the exact horizon.
Right.
So, but there's no disturbance in that sequence. Which you know, and it's frustrating but interesting.
Well, I think the fact that you have people there and potential impacts is really exciting. I guess that's something we're hoping we find. But one last question for me, unless anybody else has a question, and that's a process you didn't mention, which is there any possibility, do you think, that people in these forests were manipulating water levels either by ditching or by blocking ditches? I've always wondered about this because of sites I worked on in Norway, where you see the modern day beavers doing this to manipulate the composition of the forest. And certainly people will have been intelligent enough to do that and hardworking enough to do that. The question is, and there would be almost no evidence other than the changes in flora.
Do you know, it's a really interesting question, and I hadn't thought about it or come across anything. And in fact, what happens in lowland areas where it's thought that a dam has been made or water levels have been fluctuating, and I'm particularly thinking about Starcar in northeast Yorkshire and another site on the coast there, and I've forgotten what the name of the site is. It'll hopefully come to me as I'm talking, where there's a really good cross section through a PT filled kettle hole. And in fact, what's happened in those sites is that it's been attributed to beavers. It's been assumed that it was beavers that caused that. So it's actually a really good idea to think about, well, actually, could people have done that? Because there was definite benefit and also probably social reasons. A lot of Mesolithic sites, including some of these really high plateau upland ones, were at the time around the edge of wetland areas, probably with open water, probably with pools, even if they're only seasonal pools. Now, originally these were always interpreted as being resource bases. So you had birds' eggs, fish, the water itself, typha, marsh marigold, other plants that people could benefit from. And so there's a good range of year-round resources if you went to the wetland areas. Since then, people have suggested also there may have been spiritual reasons why people occupied lake edge, for example, and waterside sites, and it could be a combination of those. But whether people could have manipulated the water table, I think, is really good thinking, and I'm not sure how we could look for the evidence for that, but it's worth thinking about, definitely.
I've always assumed that, I mean, ditching in modern farms is a more or less annual thing. So if there were ditches, they will have been reworked over and over again. So the evidence would probably be destroyed. But anyway, yes. Okay, thank you very much for reflecting on that. Oh, well, I should probably say thank you, because you said you have to go about now. Is that correct?
I do. I am really sorry. Yeah. I've got a meeting, another online meeting I have to attend about now. I'm really happy to pick up the discussion with anybody else who's online. If you email me, and arrange a Teams talk on Zoom. I can answer any further questions. It's been really interesting for me to put it all together. I've been out of research. I've been doing about 1 day a fortnight, if that. So it's been great for me to pull this together and think through some of these things again. 2/3 of the big course what I've talked about is published, so I can send you the papers. The bits that aren't, hopefully, will be reasonably soon.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you for doing it twice. I'm sure
That's
that's
right,
very much appreciated.
It was better the second time. I definitely waffled less.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. Nice to nearly meet you all. Hopefully I can come to another event.